We are now at Megiddo, the celebrated site which is the laboratory for the attempts to identify King Solomon on the ground. There is a verse in the book of Kings, the first book of Kings, chapter 9, which specifically says that Solomon built Megiddo together with two other cities in the kingdom of Israel, Hatzor in the north and Gezer south of us, not far from Jerusalem. So the question is the following. There are monuments at Megiddo. We see behind us one of the Megiddo stables, which had been associated with King Solomon in the beginning of research. And then we are now standing in one of the palaces, which was later suggested as a symbol for the greatness of King Solomon. And the question is whether they indeed date to the time of King Solomon, because when we look at the stones, there is no inscription made by King Solomon of Jerusalem. So the issue is how to connect King Solomon in the Bible with something on the ground. It's all about chronology.
According to the Bible, King Solomon was one of the most important kings. He built the Temple of Jerusalem, if you follow the Bible, and he was also ruling an empire that went from Egypt to the Euphrates. And he invented administration. He was one of the wisest kings. He composed proverbs. He invented biology in a way. And the Queen of Sheba came to pay visit to him. And there was a judgment of Solomon, so everybody knows about Solomon. But on the other hand, also there are texts saying he oppressed his own people, he put corvée on them, and then also he had too many women that put his heart away from the God of Israel, so that after his death, the kingdom broke away.
We are now walking in the building which was presented as one of the two palaces of King Solomon at Megiddo. And it is a beautiful building and a big one, as you can see. There's another one in the southern part of the tell. And Yigael Yadin was the first one to excavate here in the 60s and present this building as the ultimate symbol of the greatness of King Solomon as an administrative building of his time. We know that Solomon lived in the 10th century BC. So we need to know that we are in the 10th century. And for this palace, as well as the other palace of Megiddo, which is no more because it had been removed by the University of Chicago excavators, we know that they are from the phase that we call Iron 2A. And in the last 15 years, because of radiocarbon studies, radiocarbon is free of all biblical considerations. And we know very well today that this building and the entire phase of the Iron 2A, they don't belong to the 10th century. So there's no question, in my opinion, that we are here in the 9th century. That is to say about, 70, 60, 80 years after the time of King Solomon. So that should not come as a big surprise because we enter the period of the great Omride dynasty of the Northern Kingdom. They were great and they are attested as great in extra biblical documents in the Assyrian inscriptions. So the palace does not, in fact, date to the time of King Solomon, but rather probably to the time of, let's say, Ahab or Joram. He's the last of the Omrides, somewhere in the first half of the 9th century BC. You can argue about a biblical phrase. It's more difficult to argue about radiocarbon. Here we are, Thomas, in another item of Solomon at Megiddo. We are in one of the Megiddo stables.
Right.
There were 5 stables over here, well, buildings identified as stables over here, and 12 of them in another part of the site. So if they operated together, all of them 17 with like 450 horses according to some. It's a big trading
Quite
center.
impressive, yeah.
With horses standing on the side aisles, and then there are the troughs for feeding them and the pillars and so on. But how are they connected to Solomon?
According to the Bible, Solomon had a lot of horses, chariots. In chapter 10, it's even said that he imported horses from Egypt to trade them to kings in Syria, in the Hittites. And of course, it's very tempting to make this relation between Megiddo and the horses. Also in the Bible, it's never said. In chapter 9, it said Megiddo, and chapter 10, horses. But of course, people would like to bring this together.
So starting in the 1920s, for 40 or 50 years, the stables were the symbol of Solomon. But then later in the 60s, when Yadin came here and put the spotlight on the palaces, things became more complicated because the stables are stratigraphically later than not on the same level, later than the palaces. So the question is again, how to date the stables. And we know that the kingdom of Israel was connected to horses also later, which means in the time of the great Ahab, we have this inscription of Shalmaneser.
Speaking of his horses, yes.
Horses at the Battle of Karkar.
They speak in this inscription about the horses of Ahab, which is such an impressive number. So
chariots,
yeah. So even if it's exaggerated, they still recognize that he was a very mighty king with these chariots,
So who is the horsemaster of Megiddo? The problem is that we are here in a domino effect. If the palaces are from the time of Ahab, then the stables are pushed still later into the 8th century BC. And they are indeed, according to modern research, dated to the 8th century BC. So we are in the time of the Kingdom of Israel. In the second great moment of the kingdom, under King Jeroboam II.
And this is a very fitting candidate, I would say, to these stables and also to the wealth that these stables show. The Bible does not speak much about Jeroboam II, but still recognize his power. So I think it's tempting to say, he is Jeroboam II.
So we are in the famous Solomonic Gate, quote unquote, of Megiddo, with the beautiful piers. Look, it is standing 2 meters high with beautiful blocks. This was, very impressive. This was first uncovered by the University of Chicago in the 1930s. But later, Yigael Yadin in the 50s, the famous Israeli archaeologist, excavated at Hatzor and found a similar gate. So then his idea was that we have the famous biblical verse in 1 Kings 9:15 saying that King Solomon built Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And since the architecture was similar, his idea was, voila, here is the proof, ultimate proof for King Solomon. He thought about an architect sitting in Jerusalem, dispatching the plans to the countryside, and then the local architects constructing gates. This was very problematic, the idea, because there were local pieces of evidence against this theory, but okay, it survived one way or another. However, in 2019, this is breaking news, we excavated here in this area, and the evidence that we have for sure is that the gate was first built in the 9th century and then reused in the 8th century and then another gate later. So we are not in a good shape. Palaces, not from the time of King Solomon. Stables, not for the time of King Solomon. Gate, not for the time of King Solomon. All of them should be dated to the 9th century or 8th century, to the time of the Kingdom of Israel. A century or two after Solomon.
If you look to the Bible, it's a little bit like archaeology. So in the story of Solomon, I think there are several stratum, and you have to identify the stratum and to see how this description can fit to different historical contexts. So we saw already in the 10th century it didn't fit. So we have to ask, where does it come from? First of all, you can see some stories are totally invented. The judgment of Solomon, if you read the story, Solomon is never mentioned, it's just the king, so they took whatever folkloristic story and put it to Solomon. On the other thing, we have seen that some stuff fits very well to Jeroboam. So I think
Yes,
in the first time, yeah.
including the gate,
Right.
because of the mention of Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer.
So that first guess we could have, that there is a stratum that tries to present Solomon with the traces of Jeroboam II, so make him like look. And we know historically that Jeroboam II had a long rule, also like 40 years, as it said for Solomon, and also that he ruled in a way from the south to the north, as it is said for Solomon. So
Maybe Jeroboam was the real united monarchy.
who knows? Yeah,
Yes.
this is a possibility. You know it. I'm not so sure, but that's a possibility.
Yes.
And then we have this description with the horses and the Queen of Sheba coming over to visit Solomon. And Solomon looks like a little bit like an Assyrian monarch.
Yes.
So we can have some Assyrian influence, and this would fit to what a lot of people think, that there is an addition of the Book of Kings at least and the Book of Samuel too at that time. So in the, let's say in the 7th century. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't work anymore because Jerusalem was destroyed, Judah was destroyed, and then they had to explain why. And then came chapter 11 saying, look, it happens because globalization does not work. Solomon was attracted by all these women. He imitated stuff of the Assyrians, Corway and so on, and that's why the catastrophe came. So at that time, Solomon was like transformed to a bad guy.
There are several cases which are really interesting here. First of all, the Megiddo horses. I mean, the
Yes.
horses and stables. Solomon is the king of the horses and stables. We know from the excavations at Megiddo that there was a city here of horses and stables
Absolutely.
and chariots. This fits into the time of Jeroboam II, who imported horses from Egypt, bred them, trained them here, and then traded them off to Assyria.
Yes,
so it
yes.
fits the 8th century. What do you think? I think that maybe the memory of this great king Jeroboam II came to Judah after the fall, the collapse of the northern kingdom, and then it became some sort of a legend.
If you look on the story of Jeroboam in the Bible, it's chapter 14, and it's just like some verses. But still, if you see in the verses, they recognize that he was a great king. So we can, in fact, imagine that they took some of the memory of this Jeroboam and transferred them to Solomon, saying it was not Jeroboam, it was our Solomon already. So
Right.
and this would quite fit in the 7th century, in this Judean taking over of the northern tradition.
The story of the Queen of Sheba is very attractive because you have an Arab queen coming all the way
Absolutely.
to visit Solomon, the great Solomon.
And the Assyrians speak about this queen.
Exactly,
So,
the queen. So she's coming, and you remember she doesn't have any breath in her when she sees the greatness
She's
of
so
Solomon
impressed.
in Jerusalem.
Yes, she's so
And this
impressed.
fits very well the time when Judah was a vassal of Assyria and participated in the Arabian trade of
Yes.
exotic merchandise from the south. So if you think about Arabs coming to Jerusalem to visit, this is the time, this is the period.
And this also explains, for instance, why Ismail Shumuel becomes son of Abraham. Because in the Assyrian documents also we have these tribes Shumuel, who are traders, and this fits exactly what you were just saying. So I think we are on a quite safe ground to say in the 7th century something's going on, writing down memories from the north, but also reflecting historical context of this time.
Always for biblical scholars, I think, when I read biblical scholarship, which I do quite a lot, I see there were heroic attempts of harmonization
Yes.
of the positive Solomon and the negative Solomon. But what we are saying now, there is no need for harmonization because we are dealing with two different
Yeah, there
layers.
are 2 layers. At the end, they have to be read together because it's in the same story.
Right.
But still, I think if you be a careful reader, then you can realize that there are really 2 layers that follow up.
Let me conclude being a little bit, the angry voice of the composer of the Book of Kings. He has in front of him a description which comes maybe from a phase a little bit earlier than his own time, describing this great king conducting trade and participating in the Assyrian globalization. And then this voice in chapter 11 tells you, you want globalization? Here is what you get.
Yeah, absolutely.
You get foreign women, you get apostasy, you get sin, you get abominations. And because of this, the God of Israel decided to break the great united monarchy into Israel and Judah.
Absolutely, and this is why we have this story in the Book of Kings.